The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight chaos. Overhead compartments slamming shut, the chatter of passengers settling into their seats, and the hum of engines preparing for takeoff. In the middle of the commotion, an unsettling moment broke through the noise.
Excuse me?
A sharp, anxious voice rang out. All heads turned as Grace Matthews, a well-dressed woman in her late 30s, stood up from her seat, her eyes wide with suspicion. Her hand trembled slightly as she pointed across the aisle. Her gaze was locked onto Alex Carter, a young black man who had just taken his seat near the emergency exit.
That man!
Grace's voice wavered, but it was loud enough to make nearby passengers pause, their curiosity piqued.
He keeps fidgeting with that bag of his. I've seen enough on the news to know we can't ignore this.
A hush fell over the section, the murmurs replaced with uncomfortable tension. Alex glanced up, startled. He had just been reaching into his bag to retrieve his medication, but the sudden spotlight left him momentarily speechless. He looked around, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes scrutinizing his every move. The flight attendants exchanged worried glances, and the tension was palpable. An invisible thread pulled taut across the rows of passengers. Grace's fear had ignited something ugly, a familiar sense of judgment, an accusation rooted not in truth, but in deeply ingrained bias. Alex swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. He had done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter now. In this moment, he was guilty until proven innocent. Earlier that afternoon, Alex Carter stepped onto Flight 287 with a sense of relief, eager to escape the stress of New York and find some peace before an important meeting in Los Angeles. The hum of jet engines filled the air as passengers boarded flight, each person carrying their own baggage of stress, excitement, or fatigue. The aisles bustled with activity, and a current of barely contained energy rippled through the cabin. It was supposed to be just another flight, but for Alex Carter, it marked the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of his patience and composure. Alex, a well-known corporate attorney with a reputation for handling high-stakes cases, adjusted the strap of his leather carry-on bag and stepped onto the plane. His calm expression belied the storm brewing inside him. The past week had been relentless, a flurry of depositions, late-night strategy sessions, and a particularly grueling battle in the courtroom. His client, a small tech company fighting a powerful conglomerate, depended on him to deliver, and the weight of that responsibility still sat heavily on his shoulders. He moved purposefully down the aisle. He cut through the narrow space, muttering polite, "Excuse me," as he maneuvered past passengers struggling with overhead bins and armrests. His gaze shifted momentarily to the numbered rows until he found his seat, an emergency exit row, chosen deliberately for the extra legroom. Alex was meticulous about details. His career depended on it. Sliding into his seat, he stowed his bag under the seat in front of him, ensuring easy access to his medication. The stress of his week had caused his heart to race more than once, and he wasn't taking any chances. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly unwind from his muscles. He hadn't realized just how exhausted he was. A few rows back, Grace Matthews observed Alex over the rim of her designer sunglasses. Grace was the kind of woman who demanded attention. Wealthy, outspoken, and unafraid to share her opinions, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who always got her way. Today, however, her confidence was tinged with a growing sense of discomfort. Grace couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about Alex had caught her eye the moment he boarded. He was too calm, too composed. Her fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest, and she frowned at the magazine in her lap, unable to process a single word of the glossy article in front of her. The world felt off-kilter, and she was hyper-aware of every little detail that didn't quite fit. Her unease sharpened when Alex leaned down to unzip his bag. She craned her neck slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of what he was doing. It seemed innocent enough. He was just retrieving a small case, glancing at a bottle of pills before tucking it back in. But Grace's heart thudded harder in her chest, and her mind raced with all the news stories she'd absorbed lately. Stories about unexpected threats and people who had appeared normal until they weren't. Grace's paranoia solidified into something darker when she spotted Sarah Porter, a seasoned flight attendant, making her way down the aisle. Sarah had worked for the airline for over a decade and had seen her fair share of incidents and unusual passengers. Grace raised her hand, her voice soft but urgent. "Excuse me," she called. Sarah stopped, her professional smile in place, though her blue eyes registered a flicker of curiosity. "Yes, ma'am? How can I help you?" Grace leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That man over there, sitting near the emergency exit, is it really safe for someone like him to be seated there?" Sarah blinked, her smile never wavering. "I assure you, ma'am, all of our passengers have been thoroughly screened. Our seating arrangements comply with FAA safety regulations." She followed Grace's gaze toward Alex, who was now flipping through the pages of a novel, oblivious to the scrutiny. Grace's lips tightened, her dissatisfaction obvious. "I know what the regulations say, but with everything happening in the world these days, isn't it better to be cautious?" Sarah maintained her calm demeanor, though a small crease appeared between her eyebrows. "If there's anything specific that concerns you, please let me know. We prioritize the safety and comfort of all our passengers." With a polite nod, she moved on, continuing her pre-flight checks. Grace clenched her fists, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. How could they be so dismissive? How could no one else see the potential danger lurking right in front of them? She returned her gaze to Alex, who had momentarily set his book down to adjust his bag. Her thoughts spun, each one darker than the last. Meanwhile, Alex felt a strange sensation prickling at the back of his neck. He had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize the feeling of being watched. He glanced around the cabin, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking it off, he resumed reading, trying to lose himself in the narrative to forget, if only briefly, about the crushing weight of his responsibilities. But the tension didn't escape Mike Reynolds, Sarah's fellow flight attendant. As he watched Sarah's exchange with Grace, he caught the subtle signs of unease spreading like a ripple. He leaned in closer to Sarah when she returned to the galley. "What's up with the lady in 24A?" he asked. Sarah sighed, her professionalism never slipping. "She's worried about the guy near the emergency exit, thinks he's acting suspicious." She shrugged lightly. "I get the sense she's not going to drop it easily." Mike nodded, glancing back at Grace, who now sat stiff and alert. "We'll keep an eye on things," he said, his voice steady but wary. As experienced flight crew members, they both knew how quickly a situation could escalate, yet they had also learned to trust their instincts, and something about this flight already felt off. Grace's discomfort only grew. She observed Alex like a hawk, her anxiety twisting into a sense of moral duty. If no one else was going to take action, then it was up to her. She felt the burden of protecting herself, and maybe even everyone on this plane, from whatever danger she was convinced was lurking just beneath the surface. A middle-aged man seated beside her, Howard Blake, raised an eyebrow as Grace shifted restlessly. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice calm but curious. Grace hesitated, then whispered, "Did you notice that man up there? The one near the emergency exit? Doesn't he seem off?" Howard followed her gaze, squinting. Alex looked utterly ordinary to him. He shook his head. "He seems fine to me. Just reading, isn't he?" Grace's frustration mounted. "That's what they all look like until they aren't," she muttered, crossing her arms tightly. Howard chose not to engage further, returning to his crossword puzzle, but Grace felt her determination harden. She wouldn't let this go, not until she was sure everyone was safe. The cabin's hum seemed louder than ever, and the tension simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt. This flight, meant to be an ordinary journey, had unknowingly become the stage for a clash of suspicion and composure, of prejudice and silent strength. And though no one realized it yet, they were all hurtling toward a confrontation that would change the tone of their journey, and perhaps their perspectives, forever. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers finished finding their seats, the gentle hum of the engine steadying into a low, comforting rumble. Flight 287 was ready to take off, but the air inside felt far from settled. Grace Matthews sat stiff and watchful, her eyes fixed on Alex Carter with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Grace's pulse quickened. She could feel the aircraft picking up speed, the weight of gravity pressing her back against her seat. It should have been a moment to close her eyes and take a deep breath, but she couldn't. Her mind was racing too fast, filled with imagined threats and the dire consequences of ignoring them. In front of her, Alex leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as he tried to let go of the tension gripping his own body. The past week's relentless pressure still had its claws in him, and he longed for a few hours of peace. But the respite he sought seemed out of reach, as he could almost sense the unease building in the rows behind him. Yet he kept his expression neutral, his breathing steady. The plane lifted off, climbing steadily into the sky, and a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain, Daniel Harris. Welcome aboard Flight 287 with nonstop service to Los Angeles. We're expecting a smooth ride today, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The captain's calm, authoritative voice briefly soothed the tension, but for Grace it was a momentary reprieve. She glanced around, searching for signs that someone, anyone, shared her unease. Most passengers, however, were now engaged in their own routines, pulling out laptops, leaning back with headphones, or flipping through in-flight magazines. Grace's irritation only deepened as she felt increasingly isolated in her fear. She was sure she wasn't imagining things. Alex Carter, with his composed demeanor and strategic movements, must have had something to hide. She replayed the memory of him, carefully checking his bag and looking around, as if making sure no one was watching. What if he was waiting for the right moment to act? Her fingers drummed on the armrest until she couldn't sit still any longer. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, craning her neck to spot a flight attendant. She waved down Sarah Porter, who approached with her trademark professionalism. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something I can help you with?" Sarah asked, her voice smooth and practiced. Grace leaned in, her whisper urgent. "I'm telling you, that man near the emergency exit keeps checking his bag, like he's worried about something inside. It doesn't feel right. Shouldn't we do something?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but she noticed the glint of anxiety in Grace's eyes. "Ma'am, I understand your concern, but as I mentioned earlier, all passengers have passed through security screenings. If he hasn't caused any disruptions, we have no reason to inspect his belongings." Grace's frustration bubbled over, and she spoke louder than she intended. "You people always say that until something terrible happens. Can't you see he's up to something?" Nearby passengers turned their heads, curious about the commotion. Alex, who had been staring out the window, felt the shift in energy and opened his eyes. His gaze flicked briefly to Grace, then away again, as if he were dismissing a minor inconvenience. But the momentary eye contact sent Grace into overdrive. She felt exposed, as if he knew she was watching him. Sarah's voice remained steady, but her eyes hardened. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. We need to maintain a calm environment for everyone on board." She glanced at Mike Reynolds, who was already moving toward the scene to provide backup if needed. Grace took a shaky breath, clamping her lips shut. Her anger simmered just beneath the surface, but she reluctantly sank back into her seat. Sarah gave Mike a subtle nod, signaling that things were under control. For now, at the back of the plane, Mike whispered to Sarah, "What's her deal?" Sarah sighed, her patience fraying. "She's convinced the guy in the emergency row is dangerous. It's all in her head, but she's not letting it go." Mike frowned, glancing in Alex's direction. "Do you think it could escalate?" Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the stress of the situation starting to weigh on her. "I hope not, but we'd better keep an eye on both of them. It feels like a storm brewing." Alex tried to refocus on his book, but his concentration was shattered. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay composed under pressure, but this was different. The intensity of Grace's suspicion and the attention she was drawing made him feel exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had dealt with hostile witnesses, aggressive opposing counsel, and high-stakes negotiations. But this kind of unwarranted scrutiny hit differently. The thought of explaining himself, of justifying his existence to people who had already decided he was guilty, made his chest tighten. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. No good would come from reacting impulsively. Grace, meanwhile, was fuming. How could everyone be so blind? Her sense of duty, warped by fear, made her feel as though she was the only person standing between safety and disaster. She turned to her seatmate, Jade Nguyen, a young entrepreneur who had been quietly typing on her laptop. Grace whispered, her voice sharp, "You've noticed him, right? The man in the emergency row? Doesn't he seem suspicious to you?" Jade, taken aback, paused her work and looked at Grace, then at Alex. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know," she replied carefully. "He seems fine to me. Maybe you're overthinking it?" Grace's jaw clenched and she leaned back, feeling a pang of disbelief. "Overthinking it?" she muttered under her breath. "That's how disasters happen. People ignore the signs until it's too late." Jade shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Howard Blake, the elderly man on her other side. Howard caught Jade's uneasy look and leaned in. "Is everything all right?" he asked in a low voice. Jade sighed, giving Grace a wary glance. "I think she's just nervous, but I hope it doesn't get out of hand." Howard nodded, his brow furrowing. "People see what they want to see," he said softly, and Jade could only nod in agreement. As the plane settled into a cruising altitude, the cabin noise returned to normal, but the tension remained. Sarah and Mike moved quietly through the aisles, checking on passengers and trying to project an aura of calm. Yet every so often, Sarah would glance at Grace, who sat rigid in her seat, eyes never leaving Alex. Alex, for his part, could feel the anxiety simmering behind him. He hated that he could predict where this was heading. He had experienced enough in his life to know that suspicion often grew like wildfire, unchecked and irrational. He reached into his bag once more, double-checking that his medication was secure. His hands lingered there, and his eyes briefly closed as he reminded himself to breathe. Grace, of course, noticed this. Her heart raced as she watched him with laser focus, her mind spinning with imagined scenarios. This was the moment she had feared. What if he was preparing to do something? What if no one else saw the danger until it was too late? Grace couldn't take it any longer. She reached for the call button, pressing it insistently. Sarah reappeared, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked. Grace leaned forward, her voice shaking. "He just checked his bag again. He's hiding something, I know it. You need to do something." Sarah's smile was strained. "Ma'am, unless he has done something that poses an actual threat, we cannot invade his privacy. Please, for your own peace of mind, try to relax. We have procedures in place to ensure everyone's safety." Grace's cheeks flushed with frustration. "Procedures," she spat. "Procedures won't stop something terrible from happening if he's planning something." She crossed her arms, her breathing ragged. Sarah walked away, her composure cracking slightly as she whispered to Mike, "We need to keep an eye on this. She's not calming down, and I'm worried she might try something." In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Harris monitored the instruments, but couldn't ignore the subtle tension crackling through the cabin. Sarah had informed him of the situation, and he was prepared to intervene if necessary. His years of experience had taught him that passengers' fears could become just as dangerous as any mechanical issue. He spoke to Sarah through the intercom. "Keep me posted. If it escalates further, we'll need to take more serious action. Last thing we need is a full-blown panic up there." Sarah's voice came back, steady but strained. "Understood, Captain. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Back in his seat, Alex sensed the subtle shift in the air, the way people glanced at him when they thought he wasn't looking. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, but he knew that anything he said could be twisted, used against him. His entire career had been built on reading people, anticipating their moves, and yet here he was, unable to escape the crushing weight of prejudice. The plane continued its journey westward, but for the passengers of Flight 287, a battle of suspicion, fear, and silent resilience was playing out in the cabin. The tension pulsed like a living thing, coiling tighter and tighter, as Grace watched and waited, determined that she alone could prevent a disaster she was sure was coming. The cabin lights cast a warm golden hue, and the soft glow from passengers' screens illuminated scattered faces, each person lost in their own world. But for Grace Matthews, the world felt anything but calm. Her heart raced, every muscle tense as she leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixated on Alex Carter. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop, a mounting dread that refused to release her. Alex, meanwhile, was trying his best to keep his breathing steady. He knew Grace's suspicion was far from dissipating, and he could feel her gaze like a physical weight pressing between his shoulder blades. His instincts, honed from years of legal battles and high-stakes negotiations, told him to remain calm, but the undercurrent of discomfort was undeniable. He tried to immerse himself in the pages of his book, but each word blurred together, his concentration unraveling. Grace's restlessness had not gone unnoticed. Jade Nguyen, the young tech entrepreneur sitting beside her, glanced up from her laptop. Jade was used to reading people. It was a skill she had sharpened over years of pitching ideas to investors and analyzing consumer behavior. And right now, she was reading Grace as someone spiraling deeper into her own anxiety. "Is everything all right?" Jade asked cautiously, her voice soft but probing. Grace's head whipped around to face her, eyes wide with a frantic kind of energy. "You see it, don't you?" she whispered urgently. "The way he keeps checking his bag, the way he sits there so calm. It's unnatural." Jade hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think he's just reading," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Maybe you're overthinking it?" Grace's expression hardened. "Overthinking?" she echoed, her voice taut. "That's how people end up on the evening news. Everyone ignores the signs until it's too late." Jade leaned back slightly, her discomfort evident. "I'm sure the flight crew has everything under control," she replied, turning back to her laptop, though her focus had been thoroughly disrupted. Grace exhaled sharply, feeling her isolation intensify. How could they not see it? How could everyone be so complacent? Her thoughts swirled into a storm, each one darker than the last, and she gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. At the back of the plane, Mike Reynolds observed the tension with growing concern. Sarah had already briefed him about Grace's fixation, and he could see that it wasn't diminishing. If anything, it seemed to be escalating. He approached Sarah in the galley, lowering his voice. "She's not calming down," Mike murmured. "What's our plan if she makes a scene?" Sarah rubbed her forehead, her calm exterior beginning to crack. "We'll have to be ready to contain the situation. Captain Harris is aware and prepared if things get out of hand, but for now, we need to keep monitoring." Mike nodded, his jaw tight. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Unaware of the flight crew's discussion, Grace's anxiety was reaching a boiling point. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she had to take action. If no one else would do something, then it was her responsibility. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more urgent than the last. She turned to the elderly man beside her, Howard Blake, who had been silently working on his crossword puzzle. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you see that man near the emergency exit, the one with the book?" Howard looked up, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Pardon?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. Grace leaned closer, her words coming out in a rush. "He keeps checking his bag. I've watched him. He's up to something, I'm sure of it. Doesn't it worry you?" Howard squinted in Alex's direction, then back at Grace. He seemed to consider her words for a moment before shaking his head. "He seems fine to me," Howard said, his voice gentle but dismissive. "Perhaps you're letting your imagination get the best of you." Grace felt a wave of anger and disbelief wash over her. "Imagination?" she snapped, her voice rising slightly. "That's what everyone thinks until something terrible happens. I'm trying to prevent a disaster here." Howard frowned, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm sure the crew knows what they're doing," he replied, turning back to his crossword puzzle, clearly eager to end the conversation. Grace's frustration was palpable. She could feel herself slipping further into a sense of righteous indignation. If no one else was willing to see the truth, then she would have to make them understand. Alex felt the atmosphere around him grow heavier, as if the cabin air itself had thickened. He tried to remain composed, but the whispers and side glances were starting to chip away at his calm exterior. He remembered the countless times he had been judged for nothing more than the color of his skin, the way strangers would tense up when he walked into a room, or the subtle but unmistakable look of suspicion. He had learned to carry himself with a quiet strength, but even that had its limits. He reached into his bag one more time, this time checking his phone. The simple act of retrieving it felt loaded, as if every move he made was being recorded, analyzed, and scrutinized. He let out a quiet sigh, his shoulders tense. Sarah and Mike continued their rounds, but their attention never strayed far from Grace and Alex. The undercurrent of tension in the cabin was undeniable, and Sarah could feel the stress settling in her own chest. This was not a typical flight, and she had to be ready for whatever might come next. The plane cruised smoothly, but for Grace, the journey felt anything but stable. She turned to Jade again, desperation sharpening her voice. "You've got to help me make them understand," she insisted. "He's dangerous. I know it." Jade's patience was fraying. She leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "Look, I get that you're scared, but baseless accusations don't help anyone," she said, her voice strained. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." Grace's face flushed with indignation. "Uncomfortable?" she spat. "Uncomfortable is ignoring a threat when it's right in front of you. How can you all be so blind?" Jade turned away, her expression a mask of unease. Howard sighed audibly, and a couple of other passengers cast nervous glances in Grace's direction. The tension was no longer just between Grace and Alex. It was seeping into the atmosphere, affecting everyone. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Harris listened to Sarah's latest update over the intercom. His jaw clenched. "If it escalates, I want a plan in place," he instructed. "Keep me informed." Sarah's voice came back, steady but strained. "Roger that, Captain. We're doing our best." Alex couldn't ignore it anymore. The hushed conversations, the judgmental stares, it was all too familiar. He took a steadying breath, forcing himself to remain calm. Confrontation was the last thing he wanted, but he knew that sometimes no amount of composure could shield him from prejudice. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity. Grace was a tightly wound spring, ready to snap. She felt her pulse hammering, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her mind replayed every piece of news she had consumed, every headline that told her to be afraid, to stay vigilant. She looked around the cabin one more time, hoping for an ally. But all she found were averted gazes and whispers. She was alone in her fear, and the realization made her desperation grow. She gripped the armrest, trying to make a decision. At the back of the plane, Mike whispered to Sarah, "She's not going to let this go. We need to be ready for anything." Sarah's jaw tightened. "We'll be prepared," she replied, though she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that gripped her. She had seen difficult passengers before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the tension sharper. The plane soared westward, but inside a different kind of storm was building. The seeds of paranoia had taken root, and each passing moment watered them, making them grow until they threatened to consume everything in their path. Grace watched, waited, and prepared to act, convinced that her fear was justified, while Alex braced himself for a confrontation he had hoped to avoid. The clash of their worlds was inevitable, and the collision was drawing ever closer. Flight was cruising steadily through the sky, but the atmosphere inside the cabin was anything but calm. Grace Matthews sat stiffly in her seat, her unease growing with every passing moment. Her eyes remained locked on Alex Carter, who was seated quietly near the emergency exit. Grace's mind was a whirlwind of anxiety, each thought feeding her paranoia. Alex, unaware of the mounting suspicion directed at him, was trying to focus on his book. He had been looking forward to this flight as a moment of quiet before an important meeting in Los Angeles. But something about the atmosphere had shifted, and he could feel it. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the sense of unease, focusing on the steady hum of the engines to calm himself. Flight attendants Sarah Porter and Mike Reynolds exchanged worried glances as they worked through their pre-flight routines. Sarah could feel the tension emanating from Grace, and it put her on high alert. As an experienced flight attendant, she had learned to recognize potential disruptions, and her instincts were telling her to watch closely. Mike approached Sarah, his voice low. "You feel it too?" he asked, nodding slightly in Grace's direction. Sarah sighed. "Yeah, something's brewing, but we need to stay calm. Let's keep an eye on her and be ready if things escalate." She knew they had to manage the situation delicately, keeping the peace while ensuring the safety of everyone on board. Grace's anxiety boiled over when she saw Alex reach down into his bag again. Her heart raced, and she leaned over to the passenger next to her, whispering urgently. "Doesn't he seem off to you?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. The passenger, taken aback, glanced at Alex, who was simply sipping from a water bottle, and then looked back at Grace with a confused expression. "I think he's fine," the passenger replied hesitantly, turning away and clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Grace's frustration mounted. How could no one else see the potential danger? She signaled for Sarah, who approached with her professional smile, though her eyes held a hint of concern. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" Sarah asked. Grace leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper. That man near the emergency exit keeps checking his bag. It's suspicious, and I think he could be hiding something dangerous. Sarah's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed slightly. I understand your concern, ma'am, but all passengers went through security. Unless there is a clear threat, we cannot inspect his belongings. Please try to remain calm. She delivered the reassurance gently but firmly, hoping it would ease Grace's fears. Grace sat back, her jaw tight. The flight attendant's response wasn't enough to quell her growing unease. Her gaze returned to Alex, her imagination running wild with worst-case scenarios. The fear made her feel trapped, helpless, and desperate. Sarah moved down the aisle, her demeanor still professional, but her mind raced. She stopped near the galley and whispered to Mike. Keep a watch on the passenger in seat 22A, she said. She's very anxious about the man in 18C. I don't think it's over yet. Mike nodded, the weight of the situation settling on him. They had handled unruly passengers before, but the intensity of Grace's fear felt different, more dangerous. The two flight attendants braced themselves for the possibility that things might get worse. Back at his seat, Alex was growing increasingly aware of the tension. He could feel eyes on him, and his instincts were kicking in, telling him to stay composed. He had learned long ago that any sign of agitation could be misinterpreted. He took another deep breath and closed his book, looking out at the clouds, hoping the flight would be over soon. A few rows back, Grace watched him like a hawk, her imagination painting him as a villain in a story of her own making. She was sure that if no one else would act, she would have to. The resolve in her eyes hardened, setting the stage for the confrontation that everyone on the plane seemed to feel coming. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin continued to build. Passengers who had initially been lost in their own worlds were now becoming aware of the thick, uneasy atmosphere. Whispered conversations and exchanged glances rippled through the rows as everyone braced for what might happen next. Sarah and Mike remained vigilant, their senses heightened and their training guiding them. They had to be prepared to manage whatever came their way, knowing that any escalation could put the entire cabin on edge. Grace sat with her fists clenched, her body rigid with fear and suspicion. Her mind was made up. If no one else took action, she would. But for now, the plane flew on, a metal tube of unresolved tension hurtling through the sky, waiting for the moment when everything might come to a head. Planes soared through the clouds, steady and unwavering, but the calm of the aircraft's exterior sharply contrasted with the turmoil brewing inside the cabin. Grace Matthews sat rigidly in her seat, her entire body tense, as if she were a tightly wound spring about to snap. Her eyes never left Alex Carter, and her mind raced with images of potential disasters she was sure only she could prevent. For his part, Alex felt the oppressive weight of suspicion pressing down on him. He had always known that being calm and composed was a necessary survival skill, especially in situations where people judged him unfairly. Yet here he was, trapped thousands of feet in the air, accused of something he hadn't done, and with no way to escape. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to signal that he was no threat. Grace couldn't contain herself any longer. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements sharp and jerky. Passengers around her jumped, startled by the sudden disruption. Her voice, trembling but loud, cut through the cabin's ambient noise. "Enough!" she declared. "I can't just sit here and pretend that everything is fine." Alex looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief moment, the cabin felt like a stage, with the two of them as unwilling actors in a drama that had taken on a life of its own. Sarah Porter, the experienced flight attendant who had been watching the scene unfold, hurried over, followed closely by Mike Reynolds. They had anticipated this escalation, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. Sarah's voice was firm but calm as she addressed Grace. "Ma'am, please sit down. You're creating a disturbance, and it's making other passengers uncomfortable." Grace ignored her, her face flushed with a mix of fear and anger. She pointed an accusing finger at Alex. "You have to search his bag," she demanded. "He's hiding something dangerous, and you're all too blind to see it." The cabin fell silent, save for the hum of the engines and the rustle of uneasy passengers shifting in their seats. Some craned their necks to get a better view of the unfolding drama, while others whispered nervously to each other. Alex's pulse raced, but his voice remained steady. Ma'am, he said, addressing Grace directly, I have nothing to hide. I'm just trying to have a peaceful flight, like everyone else here. But Grace wasn't listening. Her conviction had hardened into a near-delirious sense of righteousness, and she turned to the surrounding passengers, seeking allies. Can't you all see it? She pleaded. How can you just sit there and do nothing? What if he does something, and we could have stopped it? A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. The silence was damning, a testament to how alone Grace was in her fear. Yet she took their silence as cowardice rather than disbelief, and it only fueled her determination. Mike stepped forward, his voice taking on a firmer edge. Ma'am, if you do not return to your seat and remain calm, we will have to involve the captain. Please, for the safety and comfort of everyone on board, sit down. Grace's gaze snapped to Mike and her hands curled into fists. Involve the captain? She repeated, her voice shaking with outrage. You think I'm the problem here? You should be dealing with him. She jabbed her finger toward Alex, whose calm exterior was beginning to crack. Alex finally stood, moving slowly and deliberately, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. He knew he had to tread carefully. Any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. He looked directly at Grace, his voice controlled but heavy with exhaustion. I'm not a threat to you or anyone else, he said. He gestured to the tension between them. This is a misunderstanding, and it's causing unnecessary fear. Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She had dealt with unruly passengers before, but this situation felt different, more dangerous. She stepped between Alex and Grace, her voice low and authoritative. Sir, please take your seat, she said to Alex, then turned to Grace. And you, ma'am, need to calm down. We cannot and will not tolerate this kind of behavior. Grace's face twisted with disbelief and frustration. You're all in on it, she whispered, her voice thick with paranoia. Protecting him? Letting this happen? Sarah exchanged a glance with Mike, both of them realizing they had to act before the situation spiraled further. Sarah took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice meant to cut through the tension. Everyone, please remain calm. We are handling the situation. But Grace wasn't done. She reached forward, her hand moving toward Alex's carry-on bag. Her intention was clear, to force the truth out, to rip open the mystery she had built up in her mind. Before she could make contact, Alex reacted on pure instinct, grabbing her wrist to stop her. His grip was firm but not violent, yet the moment their hands touched, the cabin erupted into chaos. Gasps and shouts filled the air, and passengers leaned forward, alarmed by the sudden physical altercation. Enough! Mike barked, stepping forward and gently but firmly pulling Grace back. He gestured for Alex to step away, his voice carrying a warning tone. Sir, please return to your seat. Alex released Grace's wrist immediately, his face a mask of frustration and hurt. He had wanted to avoid this very moment, to prevent things from escalating to the point where he felt like he had to defend himself. But here they were, and he couldn't shake the sense of helplessness that engulfed him. Grace was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. You saw that, she cried, her voice raw with desperation. He grabbed me. He's dangerous. Sarah's voice remained calm, though her hands trembled slightly. Ma'am, you attempted to touch his personal belongings. Please sit down and stay in your seat. Grace shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're protecting him, she accused, her voice cracking. You're all protecting him, and you're going to regret it. At that moment, a new presence made itself known. Captain Daniel Harris, a man in his early 50s with the calm authority of someone who had seen it all, emerged from the cockpit. He had been monitoring the situation, and it was clear that his intervention was necessary. He approached the scene, his posture calm but commanding. Is there a problem here? Captain Harris asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Sarah stepped back, deferring to the captain. We've had a disturbance, she explained quickly. This passenger, she gestured to Grace, believes that Mr. Carter is a threat and has been causing a scene. We've done everything we can to de-escalate, but it hasn't worked. Captain Harris nodded, his expression neutral but assessing. He turned to Grace, his gaze steady. Ma'am, I understand that you're concerned, but we have protocols for a reason. Unless there is concrete evidence of a threat, you need to sit down and remain calm. Failure to do so will have consequences. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and her hands shook. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This isn't just my imagination. I'm trying to save us." Captain Harris's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "I need you to trust that we're handling this situation. Please, return to your seat." For the first time, Grace seemed to falter. The authority in his voice, the collective disapproval of the surrounding passengers, and the realization that she was alone in her fear, all seemed to sink in at once. Her shoulders slumped, and she allowed Sarah and Mike to guide her back to her seat. Her defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow, exhausted disbelief. Alex watched the scene with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He sank back into his seat, every muscle in his body taut. He had done everything right, stayed calm, and cooperated, yet he still felt like the accused. The feeling was familiar, but no less painful. The cabin slowly settled, passengers exchanging nervous glances and whispers, the energy still crackling but contained. Captain Harris gave a small nod to Sarah and Mike, signaling his approval of their handling of the situation before returning to the cockpit. Grace sat silently, her mind reeling. She didn't know how to process what had just happened, and she couldn't shake the lingering conviction that she was right, that she had tried to protect everyone and failed. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes, but she wiped them away, her pride refusing to let her break down completely. Alex stared out the window, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. The landscape below blurred together, a patchwork of clouds and sky, and he couldn't shake the sense of isolation that came with being wrongfully accused. He focused on his breathing, trying to find some semblance of peace, but it eluded him. Flight 287 continued its journey, but the events that had just unfolded left a mark. The passengers sat in an uneasy quiet, their minds replaying the confrontation. The storm had not yet passed. It had merely been paused, and everyone knew that the tension could flare up again at any moment. The cabin of flight had settled into an uneasy quiet after the confrontation between Grace Matthews and Alex Carter. Although the air was still thick with tension, passengers were trying to return to their routines. Some turned back to their movies or books, while others exchanged whispered conversations, casting cautious glances toward Grace and Alex. But for both of them, the moment of confrontation had left a lingering impact that refused to fade. Alex sat with his back pressed against his seat, his heart still pounding. The way Grace had accused him so openly, the way she had turned the entire cabin's attention toward him, had unearthed memories he had worked so hard to bury. The feeling of being scrutinized, of being unjustly suspected, hung over him like a storm cloud. He rubbed his temples, his book lying forgotten in his lap, the words unable to drown out the echo of Grace's accusations. Grace, meanwhile, sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. The adrenaline from the confrontation had left her, and she was beginning to feel the weight of embarrassment. The realization that she had made a spectacle of herself sent a wave of nausea through her. But underneath the embarrassment, her fear hadn't vanished. It had evolved into a gnawing uncertainty. What if she had been wrong? What if her instincts had led her astray? In the aisle, Sarah Porter and Mike Reynolds stood together, speaking in hushed tones. They had managed to calm the situation, but the emotional toll of the confrontation was evident on their faces. "Do you think she's done?" Mike asked, his voice low but wary. Sarah glanced at Grace, who was staring blankly out the window. "I hope so," she replied, her shoulders tense. "But we can't take any chances. Let's keep a close eye on her. And on Alex, too. He seems calm, but he's had to endure a lot." Mike nodded, understanding the delicate balance they had to maintain. They needed to keep the peace, but they also had to be ready to act if things spiraled out of control again. At the back of the plane, Howard Blake and Jaden Guyon were still shaken. Howard leaned back in his seat, his hands clasped tightly together. "I don't know how he kept his composure," he murmured. "If it were me, I don't think I could have stayed so calm." Jade nodded. "It's scary," she admitted, "how quickly things can escalate. It makes you realize how fragile this kind of peace is." They fell silent, the confrontation replaying in their minds, a reminder of how prejudice could make an ordinary situation volatile. Alex pulled out his phone, hoping that reading a few messages from loved ones might ground him. A text from his younger sister Maya caught his eye. Thinking about you. Hope your flight's going well. Love you, big bro. Alex felt his heart soften and replied, Flight's been eventful, but I'm fine. Love you too. Sarah made her way over to Alex's seat, her expression apologetic. Mr. Carter, she said quietly, I just wanted to check in. If there's anything you need, please let us know. Alex looked up, surprised but grateful. Thank you, he said. I'm all right, just ready for this flight to be over. Sarah managed a small smile. I understand, she said. We'll be landing soon enough. Her words were a small comfort, but they meant something. Sometimes being seen and acknowledged was enough. Grace was finally beginning to process her actions. Her paranoia had put everyone on edge, and she couldn't ignore the ripple effects. For the first time, she questioned whether her instincts had really been about protection, or if they were rooted in something darker, something she needed to confront. The plane dipped lower, the descent signaling that the ordeal would soon be over. Captain Daniel Harris's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Los Angeles. Thank you for your patience. The announcement brought a temporary sense of relief, but for Grace and Alex, the events of the flight would linger long after they landed. Grace stared at her reflection in the window, feeling small and unsure. Alex closed his eyes, focusing on the love and support he knew awaited him. Flight continued its journey, but the aftermath of the confrontation left a mark. Everyone on board had witnessed the clash between fear and resilience, and the echoes of that tension would remain, a reminder of how prejudice could turn a moment of calm into a storm. The plane began its descent into Los Angeles, and the captain's announcement reminded everyone on board that the journey was almost over. Yet the cabin's air still felt heavy, burdened by what had transpired. Passengers were restless, pretending to focus on their own distractions, but silently processing the tension. Grace Matthews sat in stunned silence, replaying every moment of her conflict with Alex Carter. Her certainty had unraveled, replaced by an unfamiliar shame. The look in Alex's eyes haunted her, making her question whether her instincts had betrayed her. She had always believed she was someone who protected others, but now she wondered if she had caused harm instead. Alex sat with his hands clenched, struggling to make sense of his emotions. Anger, exhaustion, and sadness. He had done everything right, remained composed, yet he still bore the weight of judgment. He thought about the countless times he and his family had discussed the need to be perfect in situations like this. Despite his best efforts, he felt stripped of his dignity. Taking a steady breath, he tried to ground himself in the thought of his sister, Maya, who waited for him in Los Angeles. Sarah Porter moved through the aisle, collecting cups and trash with an efficiency that belied her weariness. The image of Alex's calm but pained face stuck with her, as did the look of fear in Grace's eyes. Mike Reynolds, another flight attendant, caught her attention as she neared the galley. You think she's really done? He asked, nodding toward Grace. I hope so, Sarah replied, though she kept a watchful eye. The emotional toll of the flight had left its mark, but she knew her job was to keep everyone safe and calm until they landed. Back in their seats, Howard Blake and Jade Nguyen were reflecting on what had happened. It's so easy to freeze in moments like that, Howard said quietly. To do nothing. Jade nodded, staring out the window. Yeah, but we can't let fear or indecision be our excuses anymore. We have to be better next time. Howard sighed, the weight of his own inaction heavy on his mind. You're right. We owe it to people like Alex to be braver. They exchanged a solemn look, each silently committing to learning from this experience. Maya embraced Alex as soon as she saw him, her hug full of relief and love. Rough flight? She asked, sensing the exhaustion in his eyes. Yeah, Alex replied. But I'm here now. He clung to the warmth of her support, grateful for this small moment of peace. Maya could see the hurt he was trying to hide. You don't have to pretend you're okay, she whispered. It's all right to feel everything. Alex exhaled, feeling some of the tension leave his body. Thanks, Maya, he said. Let's just get out of here. Grace watched Alex leave with Maya, guilt gnawing at her. She had never imagined herself as someone who could cause such pain. The apology she had given Alex was sincere, but she knew it was only the beginning. The journey toward understanding and change was a long one, and she resolved to take it seriously. As she sat in her car, she whispered to herself, "I'll learn from this. I have to." It wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a start. Howard and Jade left the airport, walking in silence. "You think people really change?" Howard asked, breaking the quiet. Jade thought for a moment. "They can, but it takes work. Real, uncomfortable work." Howard nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Then let's commit to it." "To growth," Jade said, holding out her hand. Howard took it, and they walked on, feeling a glimmer of hope. Alex and Maya stepped into the cool Los Angeles night, the city's energy surrounding them. Maya squeezed his hand, her presence a reminder that he was never alone. "Ready to order some pizza and binge terrible TV?" she asked. Alex chuckled, feeling a spark of lightness. "Yeah, let's do it." As they left the airport behind, Alex knew the pain wouldn't fade overnight, but with his sister's support, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The cabin doors opened, and passengers eagerly disembarked, stepping into the bright terminal of Los Angeles International Airport. The tension from the flight still clung to some of them, but there was relief in finally being on solid ground. Alex Carter walked out with a mix of exhaustion and quiet resilience, grateful to leave the experience behind, but still carrying the emotional weight. Maya met him with open arms, her embrace a sanctuary. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered, sensing the pain beneath his calm exterior. "Me too," Alex replied, the warmth of his sister's presence soothing his frayed nerves. He wanted nothing more than to focus on this moment of love and safety, a reminder of what truly mattered. Grace Matthews lingered by the airport exit, the confrontation replaying in her mind. Her regret was palpable, a heaviness she couldn't shake. She thought about how fear had driven her to hurt an innocent man, and that realization left her feeling hollow. She had offered Alex an apology, but she knew it would take more than words to make things right. Grace's phone buzzed with a message from her best friend Laura. "Dinner tonight?" For a moment, Grace considered declining, wanting to hide away, but running wouldn't fix anything. She typed back, "Yes, I need to talk." Her path forward wouldn't be easy, but she was committed to understanding and confronting her biases, no matter how uncomfortable it got. Howard Blake and Jaden Nguyen were reflecting on the experience as they waited for their ride. "I can't stop thinking about how we just sat there," Howard admitted. "We didn't do enough." Jade's expression was thoughtful. "Fear keeps us quiet," she said. "But we need to change that. We owe it to people like Alex to do better." Howard nodded. "Then let's start now. No more silence." Their conversation turned into a shared promise, a determination to act when it mattered most. They had witnessed the damage that silence could do, and they were ready to be part of the change. Maya drove Alex home, the car filled with stories of work and jokes meant to lighten the mood. She knew he needed the normalcy of everyday conversation, a gentle return to peace. But she also saw the fatigue in his eyes, the toll that the flight had taken on him. "Do you ever get tired of having to be strong?" Alex asked, his voice soft and vulnerable. Maya reached over and squeezed his hand. "All the time," she said. "But strength doesn't mean never breaking. It means breaking and still choosing to get back up." Alex absorbed her words, finding comfort in her wisdom. "I just wish it didn't have to be this way," he murmured. "I know," Maya replied. "But until things change, we'll keep finding reasons to smile and keep going. Together." Grace arrived at the diner where she was meeting Laura, her stomach in knots. She wasn't just meeting her friend for dinner. She was ready to start having difficult conversations about what she had done and how she needed to change. Laura's warm smile was a welcome sight, but Grace knew this was only the beginning. Howard and Jade checked into their hotel, the events of the day still fresh. Over dinner, they discussed how they could be more active in standing against injustice. "It starts with awareness," Jade said, "and then action." Howard raised his glass. "To doing better," he said, and they toasted to their renewed commitment. Back at Maya's apartment, she and Alex shared pizza and laughter, trying to wash away the stress of the day. Maya nudged Alex, her voice teasing. "Ready to binge some terrible reality TV?" Alex grinned, feeling a small but real sense of joy. "Absolutely," he said. The laughter and the comfort of being with his sister brought a sense of healing he desperately needed. As they settled in for the night, Alex knew the pain from the flight would linger, but he also knew he had the strength and support to keep moving forward. The city of Los Angeles glimmered with life as Alex and Maya left the airport. The noise and energy were a welcome change, but the emotional weight from Flight 287 lingered. Alex knew the experience wouldn't fade easily, but Maya's presence made him feel grounded. "Ready to go home?" Maya asked, giving him a warm, encouraging smile. Alex nodded, the tension slowly easing from his shoulders. "Yeah, I just want to be somewhere safe," he replied, grateful for the comfort his sister provided. Maya squeezed his hand. "You're here now," she said, "and we're together. That's what matters." Grace Matthews was still wrestling with her guilt. Sitting in her parked car, she replayed every painful moment of the flight, her heart heavy with the realization of the harm she had caused. The weight of her actions made her stomach churn, but she knew she had to face it. Her apology to Alex had been genuine, but she understood it was only the first step in a long journey of self-reflection and change. Looking at her phone, she read the supportive message from her friend Laura and made a promise to herself. "I will be better. I have to be." Grace was committed to confronting her prejudices and taking action to educate herself. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to make real, meaningful changes. Howard and Jade stood outside the airport, the crisp night air clearing their minds. They had witnessed the pain and prejudice unfold on the plane and felt a renewed sense of responsibility. Howard broke the silence. "I keep thinking about how we didn't do enough," he admitted. Jade nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, we were passive, but we don't have to be next time," she said. "We can learn from this and make sure we stand up for others." Howard agreed, determination setting in. "No more standing by. We can't let silence be our default." The two of them shared a solemn understanding, a commitment to becoming better allies. The events of the day had changed them, and they vowed to use the experience as fuel for growth. Back in the car, Maya kept the conversation light, trying to lift Alex's spirits. She shared stories about her work and plans for the weekend, her voice filled with warmth and care. She knew that even the strongest needed moments of comfort and laughter to heal. After a while, Alex turned to her, his voice quieter. "It's hard, you know, always having to prove that I'm not a threat just because of who I am." Maya's heart ached for her brother. "I know," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry that burden alone. We'll face it together, like we always have." A small, grateful smile crossed Alex's face. "Thanks, Maya," he said. The love and support of his sister were reminders that he had a safe place to land, no matter how turbulent the world around him became. Grace met Laura at a quiet diner, her heart still heavy but resolute. She was ready to have difficult conversations, to face the reality of her own biases and how they had hurt someone. Laura listened as Grace shared what had happened, and for the first time, Grace felt like she was starting to understand the depth of her actions. Howard and Jade sat together over dinner at their hotel, reflecting on how they could be more proactive in the future. "We have to stay aware and be ready to act," Jade said. Howard nodded in agreement. "No more staying silent," he added, lifting his glass to toast to their shared promise. Alex and Maya finally arrived at her apartment. As they walked inside, the smell of pizza and the warmth of home began to soothe the wounds from the day. Alex took a moment on the balcony, looking out over the city. The pain from the flight hadn't vanished, but being with Maya and feeling the embrace of family gave him hope. Maya joined him, leaning on the railing. "The world is tough, but so are we," she said, her voice steady with conviction. Alex nodded, feeling stronger with her by his side. "We'll keep going," he agreed. And as they stood there together, the lights of Los Angeles shimmering around them, Alex felt a glimmer of peace, knowing that healing, though slow, had begun. The city of Los Angeles was alive with energy as the night settled in, and Alex Carter, with his sister Maya by his side, felt the pull of new beginnings. The emotional turbulence of Flight 287 had taken its toll, but standing here, surrounded by the vibrant hum of the city, Alex felt a sense of resilience return. The worst was behind him, and now he could focus on healing. Maya had ordered their favorite pizza, and the smell filled her apartment as they settled into the living room. "You okay?" she asked gently, setting down plates on the coffee table. Alex took a deep breath and gave her a small smile. "I think so," he said. It's been a long day, but I'm ready to put it behind me. Maya's eyes were full of understanding. Good, she said, because tonight we're celebrating. Not what happened, but the fact that you're still here, still strong, and we've got greasy pizza and trashy TV to help us forget the world for a little while. Alex laughed, the sound more genuine this time. He knew the pain and exhaustion wouldn't disappear overnight, but he had Maya, and he had hope. And sometimes, that was enough. Back at the airport, Grace Matthews sat alone in her car, staring at the empty passenger seat beside her. She had spent the last half hour replaying every detail of her encounter with Alex. The regret was suffocating, and she knew it would haunt her until she did something meaningful to change. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a text from her best friend, Laura. "Still meeting tonight?" Grace replied with a simple yes and made a mental note to have a conversation with Laura about everything that had happened. She took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of being better." Grace knew that real change wouldn't come easily, but she was committed to learning and growing from her mistakes. It was a small step, but a necessary one. Howard Blake and Jade Nguyen had left the airport and were strolling through a nearby park, the cool breeze helping to clear their minds. They were both exhausted, but their conversation was filled with a newfound sense of determination. "I've been thinking about how easy it is to stay silent," Howard said. "But silence never changes anything." Jade nodded, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. "Yeah," she agreed. "We have to be more than just observers. We have to act." Howard looked up at the stars, feeling a sense of clarity. "Then let's start by making sure we're never complicit again," he said. "We owe that to people like Alex." Jade smiled and they continued walking, the commitment to be better people lighting their path forward. Meanwhile, at a small, tucked-away diner, Grace met Laura for dinner. The normally comforting clink of silverware and the hum of conversation felt overwhelming tonight. Laura noticed Grace's distracted expression. "Hey," she said softly, "what's on your mind?" Grace hesitated, the weight of vulnerability pressing on her. "I hurt someone today," she confessed, her voice tight. "I let my fear turn into something ugly, and I need to figure out how to make it right." Laura listened, her eyes widening with understanding. "Then let's figure it out together," she said, placing a reassuring hand on Grace's. The offer of support felt like a lifeline, and Grace knew she had a long journey ahead. But she wasn't alone. Back at Maya's apartment, Alex and Maya were curled up on the couch, the remains of their pizza scattered around them. The terrible reality show on the screen had them laughing, and the tension from the day was beginning to ease. Maya leaned her head on Alex's shoulder. "You know, we're allowed to feel joy," she said, "even when things are hard." Alex's heart felt lighter. "I know," he said, "and I'm grateful for moments like this, for family, for love, for being able to keep going." Maya smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You're one of the strongest people I know," she whispered, "and we'll keep finding those moments of joy together." Alex squeezed her hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The pain from the flight wasn't gone, but it no longer felt insurmountable. With Maya beside him, in the knowledge that he could still find reasons to smile, he knew he could face whatever came next. Los Angeles pulsed with life outside, full of people carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. Flight 287 had been one chapter, a collision of fear and strength, prejudice and forgiveness. The journey wasn't over for Alex, Grace, Howard, Jade, or anyone else who had been touched by that moment. But as the stars sparkled over the city, each of them carried the hope of better tomorrows, knowing that even in a world full of darkness, light was always within reach.